Much like the Egyptians, we will see the use of gold funerary masks amongst the Myceneans. And in this case, we're looking at a funerary mask that is found in a gravesite. This is not really a remarkable statement. And it is much simpler than what we see from the Egyptians, although it does recall much the same idea. Here, they're using what's called a repousse technique, which means it's being hammered from behind into a form. They probably are developing essentially a mold, and then they've got some various textures they can add for the beard, the eyebrows, and details that are being used. And we see that the craftsmanship is not quite what we see from the Egyptians. But then again, life in Mycenae is much rougher than it is for people attached to the pharaoh in Egypt. The Egyptians can hire someone who only does this one thing, who can spend years creating the mask, whereas in Mycenae, we're probably not seeing quite the same specialization. And these masks are actually a very common practice. These would be life-size human faces placed over the face, and it would probably be placed over the face even before burial. It's a way of remembering what this person looked like as their body decays away. They're also life-size human faces. These are not portraits as such. They may have had major characteristics. So, for example, the facial hair might be pretty much the same, but the ears are generalized, the nose is generalized, the facial structure is generalized. Now, the question that comes to mind is it idealized because it's a king, or is it simply generalized? And sometimes it can be very difficult to tell. In other words, are we just looking at a face that looks human and has a couple of the characteristics of the actual person? Or are we looking at something that they've intentionally made far more beautiful than the person involved? It also raises another question. If you're doing a death mask for someone like this, what age do you depict them at? If the king dies at age 65 after a brutal disease, do you want to remember them in that state? Or do you pick some other age, and how do you choose it? Probably they're picking a younger age. We see this in other Greek art later on. And this is because we tend to think of ourselves at our peak. We don't tend to think of ourselves at our low point. If you've ever known someone who died of a long disease, you don't typically think of them solely in terms of what they look like in the last days in the hospital. You tend to think of them in terms of what they look like earlier in their life when they were more vibrant. And so that may be what's happening here as well. Either way, we see this need to create something to remember the image of the person, and using gold because of its connections to the gods, to the sun, its purity, and all of the ideas that we've dealt with before.